One of the things research has shown in a few studies now, both the constraints-led approach and differential learning, is doing that, learning a skill that way. There's a couple of soccer studies, for example, actually reduces the incidence of injury because you're learning to do the same movements in all these different ways. You're not putting the same stressors on the same joints and same body bones and things. So instead of, having someone do the same volleyball spike 100 times in practice, why not, if we add some random, jump off this foot instead, come from this angle instead, do a twist, and you're giving the body different inputs. So not only is that seem to be beneficial for performance, also for injury prevention as well.
That was Rob Gray, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's podcast is brought to you by our longtime sponsor, SimplyFaster.com. There's 2 items I'd like to talk to you about today that you can find in Simply Faster's online store. Whether you're a coach or an athlete, these are both things that you'll find highly useful as tools in your training toolbox. The first is blood flow restriction training methods. And after hearing about blood flow restriction training for years now, as well as the results that athletes are getting with it, especially in, for example, lactate sports like swimming, 100-meter freestyle, and not only hearing of that, but also seeing how much some swimmers had liked that type of training method, I knew I had to start trying it out myself. So I've been utilizing the air bands. I really enjoy it, both the feeling while I'm actually training with them, as well as seeing the visual result of spending time training with the methods and then the strength result. They've been a really cool training tool, and I would definitely recommend checking into air bands. SimplyFaster.com also has Be Strong brand blood flow restriction. The second item is the VMAX Pro, and this is a new option for velocity-based training, barbell tracking. It provides valuable load-based data, including speed in all phases of a lift, and it delivers key metrics such as power, velocity, distance, as well as duration of effort. The VMAX Pro system measures any lift you can think of. It's portable, durable, and intuitive. You can check out these 2 items and much more at our sponsor, SimplyFaster.com's online store. Let's get on to the show. Welcome to another episode of the show. It's great to have you here. In the world of motor learning, sometimes we hear terms like differential learning, constraints-led approach, repetition without repetition, or dynamic systems theory. And occasionally I think it can be easy to look at those terms as these just ideas floating around in space. That for a lot of people, or even myself at one point, I had a hard time connecting those and having those hit the earth in this grounded day-to-day training basis. As we learn more about how we learn, though, which everything is learning, even a bicep curl involves motor learning on the level of the muscle and managing fatigue in the muscle, to a isometric hold, to a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, to reading and perceiving multiple defensive players. Everything we do as athletes involves learning. The longer I've been doing this, the more and more I appreciate that fact, and the more and more shows I will do that involve these concepts. So whether you're a strength coach, a sport coach, an athlete, a parent, whatever element or area of the field you're in, how we learn is one of the most important things you can understand. I'm excited to have back on the show for the second time, because we kind of ran out of time last episode, Dr. Rob Gray. Dr. Rob Gray is a professor at Arizona State University and the host of the Perception and Action podcast. He has been conducting research on and teaching courses related to perceptual-motor skill for over 25 years. Last episode, Rob got into the constraints-led approach to movement versus the idea of teaching fundamentals. On this episode, he will go into the constraint-led approach's counterpart, which is differential learning. So we'll be talking about the difference between differential learning and the constraints-led approach, and where each element or method of learning is more applicable. And then on the back end of the show, Rob will talk into ideas on stacking constraints, using games, exploration, turning the velocity dial as a constraint, so speeding things up, slowing them down. And finally, he'll get into the very promising results of his research showing the effectiveness of a variable practice model in baseball and how that allowed players to reach a higher level. So again, it really doesn't matter if you're on the strength side, the skill side. This is amazing stuff for all athletes. And there are definitely concepts here and principles that will plug right into what you're doing. I really enjoy the concepts of motor learning and learning more about this wonderful aspect of our field. That said, let's get on to episode 312 with Rob Gray. Rob, thank you so much for coming back on. Last episode we got through, I got it here, about 5 or 6 questions in over an hour, and definitely didn't have time for the second half of my question list. So I really appreciate you coming back on. And we'll get started here by getting into a little bit more on differential learning. Last time we talked a ton on variability and the constraints-led approach. And I'm just curious, how is differential learning, how is that different than like just the variability between reps or variable learning?
Yeah. And thanks for having me back on, Joel. It's nice to be back. Yeah. I think, first of all, there's a lot in common. Both the constraints-led approach and differential learning are starting with the fundamental idea. There's no one way to do things. There's no ideal technique. You need to let the athlete explore and find their own. The way that I think of it is, and I don't know if everybody agrees with me, but this way is the constraints-led approach is a bit more focused. You are trying to help guide the athlete. You have a rough idea of where you want them to be, and you're trying to help guide them by adding a constraint. So adding a constraint, I just recorded stuff where they were looking at weightlifting, how to do a clean and jerk properly. So one of the problems beginners have is they hold the bar, throw the bar way in front of them, which can cause injury and you lose a lot of momentum. So you want to keep the bar close to your body. So a constraints-led approach would be to put chalk on your shirt. So that I'm adding, and tell the person you have to get chalk on the bar. So I changed the task itself by adding something new to get you to do kind of the pattern that I'm looking for. But I'm not telling you how to do that. I'm just adding a new constraint. That's kind of the fundamental. Differential learning has the same kind of goals, but what we're going to do is instead of adding a constraint to push you in a certain way, we're going to make you do a different thing every trial. So it's kind of random variability instead of focused variability. That's what the main difference. So in my example, maybe I'll get you to do different stances, feet close together, feet far apart, different shaped barbells, different surfaces, different. So what we're getting you to do is try a whole bunch of different things with the hope that you'll kind of learn your movement, how your movement affects things, learn the solution space, and find something on your own rather than trying to push you in a certain direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. So basically, the constraints-led approach is almost more of a direct, more hands-on. Like, okay, you have this is the flaw in your technique. Here's some constraints to help hone in on that. Whereas differential learning is almost more like kids on a playground. If would that be an accurate way?
Yeah, I sometimes the inventor of differential learning is Wolfgang Schulhorn, and he sometimes he doesn't agree with when I say this, but I think differential learning is more variability for variability's sake, right? It's not trying. Another way to think of it is in a constraint-led approach. I'm really trying to get you to move the way I want you to move in competition, right? So I want you to lift that barbell with the same way that you're going to do it in the Olympics, because that's the effective way to do it. Whereas differential learning, I'm getting you to try things I never want you to do again, right?
Yeah.
There's examples. They have published studies on speed skating where they ask the athlete to do a pirouette before they start, where they start with one eye closed, one arm up in the air. So they're things that you would never, ever want to do in actual competition. They're there to add variability to get you to explore, right? So it's I call it kind of variability for variability's sake. You're adding kind of random perturbations to the movements to get people to try different things rather than adding them to get them moving towards a certain solution.
Got it. So I almost could view that as, well, I guess in the more specific sense. I guess in the general sense, I would think just running through a forest, like jumping over the logs and on weird pathways. And you're not running how you would if you were just in a flat out race. It's just good variability to expose yourself to all sorts of different movements. Or something I've liked doing for a warm up, like in just running, is instead of the drills, and instead of even necessarily like a constraint that's kind of in the bandwidth of what you're going to do, I like to think of it in the sense of, here's some like mini hurdles and they're just at random distances, or here's some cones and they're just totally random distances, and you got to bound through them, and it's just going to be weird. It's not going to be, some of the strides might be kind of like competition, but some might not. It's just an interesting problem to solve that kind of almost like breaks wider the nervous system, I guess, if that makes sense. And using that to prepare.
For sure. And I think you gave a great example at the start. That's what kids, my kids been taking pickleball lessons. And one of the things the coaches do I really like is the warm up at the start. They let the kids run around the court, and the first kid in front just does whatever he wants, skips, jumping jacks, sprints, hops, and the other kids have to do the same thing. So it's completely random what they decide to do. They're getting warmed up by just doing a bunch of different movements. They're not, okay, now stretch your hamstring, now stretch your arm. Like, it's not as coordinated as that. It's just, let's just move in random ways. So, so that's a good example for sure.
Yeah, got it. That makes good sense. I've heard similar things like that, like for kids, like martial arts warm ups, and it's just funny because I feel like, I think a lot of youth sport coaches, especially people who haven't been through the PE system, like they just don't. It's just drills. Like, let's just start with drills that are kind of like the sport, and there's nothing where it's almost like the same in some. It's kind of like the off season and in season too, like playing a different sport, something that's totally different for variability's sake as well as other things. So that makes good sense to me. So, what is your thought about that effect from playing multiple sports as well? Where I think we sometimes look at it as like there's maybe some shared characteristics, but then also completely different. So that just fits in throughout the year as well than if you're playing multi-sports, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I think you learn different movements and how to control your body in different ways. Like playing baseball, football, or whatever it is. I think there's some kind of commonalities. How to use space, how to transfer force. There's some things, that you grasp between the different sports. So, I think there's a lot of diversification. I think it's good for a lot of reasons, keeping kids engaged, fun, but it also, it can definitely have kind of some, there's this concept I talk about in the book, donor sports, where training in one sport can help you better in your main sport, training in another sport. So, that definitely has some of that.
Yeah. Would you also, I've heard like Bruce Shexted, our track coach, talk about on the days he's like going for big high outputs. It's very simple. There's not a lot of variability, but when he's on his recovery days, he wants it to be as diverse as possible. And I would imagine that's where the variability for variability's sake is more like, would you associate that with recovery as well? Like I'm going to recover mentally and physically from the really like intense thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think I like that overall general idea, kind of periodizing skill, right? Mm-hmm. So you're not always doing all these crazy things. You're right. If you really want to focus on achieving a specific performance goal, you'd never add all these variations, right? Recovery, I think it would be good. I think break it up. And, one of the things research has shown in a few studies now, both the constraints-led approach and differential learning, is doing that, learning a skill that way. There's a couple of soccer studies, for example, actually reduces the incidence of injury because you're learning to do the same movements in all these different ways. You're not putting the same stressors on the same joints and same body bones and things. So instead of, having someone do the same volleyball spike 100 times in practice, why not, if we add some random, jump off this foot instead, come from this angle instead, do a twist, and you're giving the body different inputs. So not only is that seem to be beneficial for performance, also for injury prevention as well.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit, and I'm not sure how close this is, whether it's a constraint-led or I feel like there's some gray area too, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like Bobby White, who's a basketball coach and strength coach, was having, if you look at his social media, he has athletes doing all these acrobatic skills in the air, and he had one post saying, I think it was like a criticism or a comment saying, "Oh, you would never do that in the game," and like maybe not, but I think that even it's still variability for variability's sake. It's still like you could almost warm up with, if you could even use those to warm up and just have like that almost non-specific diversity. Of course it could be specific at some point too, but it makes me think about that as well versus, again, just kind of a more like everything should be always completely relevant.
Yeah. And I don't blame people because sometimes we give kind of mixed messages. We give a message. There's this term we used all a long time, specificity of practice, right? In order for practice to make you better in the game, it has to be similar to the game, right? That's the idea of specificity. But now we're saying that you can do all these crazy things that aren't really all that similar. So it's it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. I think it is you have to be clear on that. And there's certain things that you want there. The other kind of thing that differential learning keeps is similar to the constraint set approaches. It keeps certain, you have certain elements there. Perception, action, coupling, things in context, right? You would never do a differential learning thing where you had a person do a task on a computer screen, right? That's not differential learning. That's not for playing soccer. That's something completely different, right? So there are certain things you want to be similar to the game, but the key point, not everything has to be similar, right? If we want people to get better, we need to deliberately change things from the game, right? That's what coaching is, right?
Yes, exactly.
But yeah, I see why people have that comment a lot for sure.
Yeah. So in some ways, and just put like designing a practice, like in one session, would it be fair to say, and I've seen this a lot, like this seems to be a format that I find it enjoyable personally, is starting with, let's say my sport's basketball, like starting to warming up with a game like soccer, to warming up with soccer, like there's a differential learning. And then you go into your practice and that's filled with constraints and like constraint-led approach. I don't know how you cool down. You could cool down with a variety of ways, but that seems like a pretty like a good flow, like looking at how it almost probably blends together. Would you say that's kind of a good way of looking at a differential? And then
yeah, I think so. I think mixing them can be good. One of the things that was worked really well for me is kind of adding them together.
Oh, cool.
So I'll give you an example. So one of the things I worked for a lot of years on was getting baseball players to hit the ball in the air more. Right? With the way the baseball is now, the more you hit it in the air, the more home runs you hit, the better. Instead of what we were taught as kids, put the ball in play and hit it on the ground. Baseball, if you're at high level, the fielders are too good. You're going to be out, and they shift now. But anyway, what would I used to do is I would add a constraint. We'd put a fence across the field or barrier across the field, and we tell you had to hit over it. So that's a constraint set approach. I'm adding something to the task to make you move in a certain way. I'm not telling you, but I want you to get the ball in the air. Sometimes I found athletes would struggle with that because they couldn't figure out, even when they did it successfully, they couldn't figure out why. What did I do differently to get the ball in the air? So what I would do is add differential learning on top of that by saying, okay, now I want you to switch between different bat weights. I want you to stand way up in the box. Now stand way back. Now I'll use a wide sense. So what I was getting people to do is try to explore different movements to figure out what works and what doesn't to achieve this goal. So I sometimes like to add them together like that. Or, I think different practice sessions that you can do different kinds of things. It's sometimes fun if you work with kids and stuff, sometimes it's fun to have the kids help make them up. Come up with them. Either the constraints or differential learning, come up with a new rule for soccer.
Yeah.
Like it can be as crazy as you want. And you have to keep your hands behind your head or, that can be really fun and it achieves some of the same things.
So it kind of, the more I learn about all this stuff, the more I look at that, like the kids on the playground. And the more I think you realize that when you just let kids go, like Jeremy Frisch talks about, just let kids go and watch them, like when they're making up their own rules, right? They're inserting different differential learning automatically. Like they're making up their own rules. They're setting their own parameters. Obviously at some point they're going to need some more guidance, but on that just basic, lower level, if you let them go, a lot of times they're doing the things that they need to in many ways. And too, different, as long as it's not this pristine surface, a lot of times they're in different types of fields and different, if it's baseball, there's maybe a different home run, setting or whatnot. A lot of times that just comes just by virtue of, I forget I think it was this podcast we talked about Brazil, they have all the different kind of.
There's some good, they play on beaches and rocky roads. Yeah, for sure. I think we do as kids. I think you're right in pointing out we need more to go beyond that. Kids aren't usually going to become super elite on their own. They need some, coaching and structure. But I do think, I always talk about, I grew up playing hockey from Canada and we would just naturally, one team didn't have a goalie. Well, turn the net around or add a rule that you have to shoot it in the top of the net to score. Or, that kid's way older and better. Well, they have to do this. Kids are naturally good at playing this way and making up rules and adjustments and handling we only have 2-on-3 to play basketball. Okay, let's make up a game.
Yeah.
We aren't very good at that as kids. And then we lose. We feel like everything has to be super structured for some reason as we get older sometimes.
Would you say, I'm trying to think of another example, how I can kind of think about how the differential and the variable kind of stack on top of each other. And I think about one thing that always intrigues me is, especially from like being a track coach and looking at jump technique and stuff, is watching like dunking, like just like pro dunking. The dunking element of basketball has really gotten, like it's really taken off in the same way that extreme sports has in some ways. You know, like the tricks that people were doing that were amazing 30 years ago, like 11-year-olds are doing now. Although dunking isn't quite like that because people are just too short. But I mean, on a 10-foot hoop at least. But I'm always blown away by just the technical self-organization that these athletes are creating for themselves. And I think it's a really good mix of what you're talking about on both ends. Because to me, it's like the constraint is how high is the hoop. Like some days you might dunk on an 8-foot hoop, a 9-foot hoop. You go to a park and it's like 9.6 and it's bent down a little bit. You know, those are always the good ones. I could really dunk on those. And then the differential, I guess, would be, well, I'm going to do a 360. I'm going to take off 1 foot. I mean, if you're playing a game, can you dunk on somebody or someone's going to come and try to block you? Like that would be the differential then. And the constraint is like more just like how high is the hoop? Is it a wood floor? Is it a, asphalt? Is that like a good picture of things? Like,
I think kind of as a basic, yeah, for sure. I think the constraints, usually we think of constraints as like something a coach adds, like deliberately changing. But I think like in terms of playground, for sure, I think that's a good example of adding the two together, adding some, working around constraints with and adding kind of variability and exploration and creativity and things like that.
Got it. So with all this, I think there's always the poles, in the sense that on one end, maybe on one pole, it's all drills. It's the youth sports coach that just puts out the cones and it's all perfect technique and do it this way. And then on the other end, I mean, when do we know that maybe we're getting too far away, if that makes sense? Like too much variability, too much differential? Because I do think it's important to always, there's that pendulum, right? And we always got to come back to at least having that right train. Any thoughts on like, how do I constrain these constraints to the point that we're adapting forward, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think on a more individual level, like I always tell, there's a kind of this myth out there that using these the differential learning and constraints is just kind of set it and forget it, right? So I give you this task and I'm not allowed to step in or say anything. I just have to let you do anything you want. That's not true at all. Like as a coach, you still want to be looking for certain things that that they need to be effective. Like, so one of the examples I give, I kind of done work with tennis players for a while now. And what I used to do, just like everyone, is, okay, here's some drills to teach you the proper way to hit a forehand. You need to hit it in front of you. Then you need to do it in an arc. Now what I do is I start with games and let kids play. And 90% of the time, they'll, if you design the game right, they'll do that. That stroke will just come out on its own. But if it doesn't, then I don't let them keep doing whatever they want. If they're hitting the ball way behind them and flat, you got to step in and give them a new constraint or a new task to try to get them. So that's one thing, right? Have certain, I call them invariants, key features that have to be there. If they're not there, then you step in as a coach. On more a team level, if you're doing something like small-sided games, if the team's not really taking if you're trying to design a constraint to make them pass more and they're not, like don't be afraid to stop. Like you don't have to let these things run and where they're not being productive, I think. But it's way harder than the traditional drills, right? Because we can't just measure how long it takes you to get around the cone. We're asking you to explore and try different things. So we have to be willing to recognize it being more chaotic and unpredictable. So but those are kind of the things I look for.
Yeah, that makes good sense. Yeah, just it's truly an art form in the sense that we're looking for it in the moment, seeing is basically their intention, and they're not able to cheat the constraint and to have a different strategy than what I intended as I'm coaching, like coaching being more constraint led versus differential.
For sure, yeah, and that's something I try to emphasize a lot. These approaches are not an alternative set of drills, activities. They're a set of principles you apply to almost anything you want. But it takes a ton of skill from a coach to design them and to adapt them and adjust them, work with the players to get their input. What did you think about this and things like that? So it is I think it's much more fun, but it does
100%.
take a lot of skill from the coach for sure.
100%. would you mind going into some of those games specifically for tennis? Because, if I end up playing my brother here in the next 6 months, maybe I can get some extra practice on my end, right? But I mean, just to help me kind of put this into, like, see that in action, like, what if they're missing something, what are some of the things that you would specifically utilize, or some of the games, examples of some of the games that you came up with?
Yeah, like tennis. So for tennis, the biggest thing that's been shown to be really effective, especially with kids, is scaling the equipment properly. So get balls that are lower compression, that don't bounce as high, smaller rackets that are appropriate for the size. So that leads to better swing the stroke unnaturally. And then, I just play with kind of the spacing, where you do like a game on half the court, have them, do a kind of rallying close. So adding kind of different constraints in terms of where you can play the ball, how you can hit it, but trying to keep it, get them in rallies as quick as possible. I think different, you can get into different balls eventually.
Yeah.
But a bunch of different things. It kind of depends on what, it's a challenge, especially if you're with kids. You can come in and you have some really skilled players, and then you have someone that maybe barely has eye-hand coordination, right? They can barely contact the ball. And so trying to coach those two at the same time, come up with different things, that's the real challenge where, it helps to have someone helping you and be able to pull that person out and do something different. Yeah.
Today's episode is brought to you by Lost Empire Herbs. If you would like to try Pine Pollen by Lost Empire Herbs for free with just the modest cost of shipping, you can head to justflypinepollen.com. Pine pollen is one of 4 ingredients in the Phoenix formula, which is one of my favorite Lost Empire Herbs products, which also includes Shilajit. I notice a really beneficial impact on my energy, my strength. I really enjoy Lost Empire Herbs company, their mission, and their products, and I know you will too. If you want 15% off your Lost Empire Herbs order, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. And again, for that free sample of pine pollen with just the modest cost of shipping, head to justflypinepollen.com. All right, let's get back to the show. Yeah, I've seen that personally with volleyball. Like I've been coaching a little bit of youth soccer, and after a season, I asked my daughter, who's 5, like, hey, what sport do you want to play next? And she's like, volleyball. And I'm thinking, like, 5-year-olds in volleyball, like the typical, that just doesn't work very well. So I was talking to Jeremy Frisch a little bit, and of course we got balloons, but I found like an oversized volleyball on Amazon. So I got it, and it's like probably about 50-75% bigger than a regular volleyball, super forgiving, and she loves it. And my 3-year-old, well, he's now 4, son loves it. Like he could play, and he would like unnecessarily dive for it on the carpet. But I almost feel like there's something good in that, diving even when you don't have to. Like I feel like it's almost like you see that because he wants to make it more complex. He wants to add that in. I think there's something good there to this, but it wouldn't happen if we had like a little small volleyball. We needed the bigger one.
No, that's a great example. I think, Jordan, the key is that you're not, old way we would do it, right, is use a regulation volleyball, and let's go through a bunch of drills to teach you proper how to set it, and so that we can make it so that you can get some proficiency, and which is unbelievably boring. Yes. Your daughter probably went, I don't want to play volleyball anymore. But if you switch the ball, then they can actually start playing the game and get some of the basic things down. So yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that, just being more in the youth sports world now, and I talk with neighbors, and it's like, hey, what sports are your children in, and what are they? And flag football is really popular around here with like 5-year-old. Like I've heard of 4-year-olds playing flag football, and I'm just like, the amount of setup by parents in that, it's just insane. Like you got to have a lot of. It's all. I mean, these kids are not obviously capable of directing any of the plays. It's the parents who have to do almost everything. And I just think if you could just invent it, I'm definitely the opinion, at least for the most part, not entirely, but the more free flowing it is, the better. The more you don't have to set things up, the more it's just going, and it's just like bigger, more forgiving, balls or things that can just continue. Like it almost makes me think, at what point, how would you build up to football in a free flowing? I guess soccer, right? Like, and I don't know where the donor, when you start tackling people, I guess rugby or whatever, but it just makes me think about what's the transition, to that with a free flowing perspective.
Yeah, I think you're right, Joel. I think, I think if you try to do proper football, like if you keep giving kids, no, That's against the rules.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you can't do that. I think they would not want to play very quickly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think idea of the donor sport is learning to move in space, learning to the term uses affordances. It has some of the same opportunities for action, learning to get away, get open. So I think soccer would be a good start for football for sure. You're learning running and passing. Obviously, it's your feet, but you could make like a soccer, a simple throwing game and something like that. So I think thinking about games that have some of the key elements, but maybe not all the rules, and then slowly adding it. I think that's a good way to do it.
Yeah, I think of it a little bit like pole vault and track and field's an interesting one, right? Because there's certain things you need to be able to do before you can pole vault. Like you can't, like if I took like a 6-year-old and I said, I mean, you could take a stick and say vault the river. Like I've seen Michael Zweifel doing that kind of thing in his. Actually, it's funny now that I think about it. I was like, yeah, you could actually. Wouldn't this be a great? I've talked about this way too many times in the sense of like I think I'm just I get stuck on things. Like I'm really into motor learning now. I mean, I've always kind of been, but I think about it more, and I think about, okay, well, what's like a great progression from youth up to this skill? So if you're going to teach pole vault, it could be like have a dowel rod and vault over a river, and then it just gets a little longer or not a river, but like between two mats, that's the river. Like, sorry, I say 2 mats in the gym, and you find a way to vault over, and then it just happens to get higher every year, and then it happens to be a bar over it at some point. And it's just fun. And maybe you play tag, and you have to get away doing that or something like that. Would be awesome. I feel like. Anyways, just long story short is, like you see that volleyball, and it's so much fun. Like I can't imagine, even in soccer, I'll walk out off the field and I see like it's like a 10 or 12-year-old team, and there's like lines of 10 kids, and it's one kid at a time. The coach is like throwing the ball one at a time, and the kids have to just kick it back. I was like, this is the most boring drill. like how long should the line be before like, no, like this is too much. This is just boring at this point.
Yeah, and I think, Joel, I think there's great points there. I think one of the things that bothers me a lot is I think we're doing a lot of this with the idea that we have to move everyone towards elite sport endpoint. Like everyone in volleyball, we have to teach you all the proper ways to move and set like you're going to be on the Olympic team. Why can't we just have some kids learn that moving around and playing around is fun, and maybe later in life they end up playing in the rec league in the beach, and instead of learning, I'm not good at this, I'm uncoordinated and never go near a volleyball court again. Like if we teach them to learn and move and have fun, instead of here's how you have to do it to be, not everybody can be elite. Like, like it's just the idea of you have to master these set of fundamental skills, or we can't let you play, or we kick you out of it, is really, it's sad in a lot of ways.
100%. Like Jeremy Frisch said this post on Twitter. It was something like, why are all youth sports like clubs called elite now? Like you look at and it actually, I think that adds to that mentality, and that you've been on Rafe Kelly's podcast, and he talks about that in the sense of like it's like if you don't play a sport, then you just forget about movement for your life pretty much, and it's just I'm just going to go on the treadmill or the elliptical and just put in my time and burn my calories and I'm out, and that's not fun nor sustainable for a lot of people, and we lose out on a lot of just being human and having fun and moving, and so. Yeah, if we just took a lead away, even, I feel like that would help us.
I think, it's the idea of like under 10 elite. Is like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, this 8-year-old team, elite.
Yeah, and the competition, and parent, like you mentioned at the start, parents really feed into this, right? They all want their kids to be the next great athlete, and kind of this machine industry of kids sports that make so much money. So, but it's tough. It's like a race example, like parkour is like, we never, like, that's just a weird thing these really super fit people do, right? Yeah. It's not something that you would encourage, even though that's really what kids do it on the playground naturally. If you let them, they jump between things all the time in different ways. But we kind of don't foster it in any way or help grow it.
Yeah, or they play tag on the playground and chase tag parkour. Like that's the most exhilarating thing ever. I think if you get an opportunity, like when I went to Return to the Source with Rafe, we played chase tag in the woods with these huge like fallen logs that were also like hurdles, and you could like run on the logs, and it's basically like being a kid again, but in a huge like nature size arena. And I just remember we did it in a stream once where we were playing tag with all these huge rocks, and I was like, there's so much information here, like there was so much like excitement here. Like this is like what I did when I was a kid, but it's even more, like it's even crazier. Like it was really intense. And I just felt like, I was like, this is such a great breeding ground for all these things.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think, it'd help, if we want to get really, it would help health later on in life if people were kind of taught how much fun it can be.
Yeah.
Instead of beyond being an elite, a professional athlete, right? There's a lot of fun things you can do with movement. Yeah.
Yeah. And even in the process of those people who do make it to the elite, I feel like they could, maybe be a little better, but more so to me, I feel like have a more fun and sustainable journey throughout their elite years. And even I was just talking about this on a different podcast, like Steph Curry, there was like a video of him. He like starts at like the free throw line, he makes it, moves back to the 3-point line, makes it, keeps going back, just great, crescendoing back. He's like having fun, like it's like this differential. Is he going to shoot it from half court again? No, but it's like, it's just different. It's almost like differential at that point, I guess. It's just kind of fun and variability for variability's sake, because you wouldn't shoot from out there. I guess you could, some people do, but way out there. It's it's just people
he's
know how to
not grinding out the same shot over and over. Yeah, he's having fun. Yeah, for sure.
It's all this stuff too. I do actually want to ask you a question that probably would be more applicable, and I love talking about this stuff. Part of it is because I do have children who are in this landscape, but also for anyone, whether you work with high school or college or pro or wherever, or if you're just on a lot of people listening to this are on the physical prep side, it's really important, in my opinion, to see, the more you see of the whole journey, I think it's really valuable. But also, I think even in the gym, it was a Michael Zwiefel and Sean Mishka and Tyler Yerby's course and their little weight room piece, which I really liked. They talked about like exploration movements, like here's a bear crawl, but it's explore bear crawl. So you can just do whatever groundwork you want to do, and they'll do it like in between sets or as a warm up. That would be, or like we're going to warm up for squat, but just you can play around. You can do a wide stance, a narrow stance, a lateral squatting. That would all be differential, right? Because it's not really the squat or the movement or the crawl the coach necessarily would have you do, but it's just, and I also feel like the weight room isn't the sport anyways. So, in so many ways, like I think there is potentially even more room for exploration as long as you're, honing to the big rocks and the tension and the tensile qualities you need to get out of what you're doing. But in terms of a lot of what we do in there, I think it's important to think, well, in so many ways, this is differential learning anyways. Like so.
It can be, for sure. Yeah, if you do it the way those guys do it, I think it just, you're preparing your body better. You're learning about your body. The way we do things, like we get you to do these very exercises with very strict, keep your knees over your toes. You have to do this. And then you go out in the field and you extend way over here and you get hurt. We wonder why, right? Yeah. We never teach you how to distribute the force over there and do this, where we could be in the gym for sure, building up and building up so much more than just bench press or learning to control force, learning to balance and stability. Those are so much, especially like you're stabilizing your body with forces is so important, and we get so little experience learning how to do that. We really don't push it very hard, where we keep everything super safe and you have to do it this way. So I think we could do a lot with that too, and connect it nicely with the more skill focused variability, for sure.
Yeah. In the world of the I guess the constraints and differential learning too, in some ways of looking at it, I guess maybe some of these are there's a little bit of gray, but like in the gym, like the constraint would be basically like the lift and then the weight on the bar, right? Like those are and then the differential learning could be, well, try this lift with this wide stance, this narrow stance, maybe like kind of your positioning, playing around with your positioning and things like that. Would that be a way of looking at the gym in that respect, or
so yeah, it can be. So the way that I would say it is, all the tasks start with some basic constraints, like how much weight there is, but as a coach, you could use wider stance as a constraints-led approach. So something the person's doing, they're off, their stability's poor. So I want you to I'm going to add a constraint that you have to touch these two barriers. So that's a constraint because I'm adding a wider stance because I want you to solve a specific problem or move in a certain way. A differential learning approach would be more, every time you lift the weight, I want you to use a different stance.
Got it.
So you're not adding it to get rid of or address the specific issue. You just, I want you to try, kind of like the way you're mentioning with Sean and Tyler, like try it this way, then that way. And often in differential learning, you often give the person instructions about how you want them to do it on every. So on this one, I want you to close one eye, hold your arm behind your back. This, yeah. So it's kind of that. Sure.
Yeah. When you say that, it makes me think about something, how I really like using the differential then in the gym perspective, or maybe just the more like if sport being really chaotic and open, right? There's a ball flying around, like the gym or even track, there's less craziness potentially, unless you're like running in like a hailstorm or something. But with that, I feel like something I actually saw from tennis physical prep coach Gil Reyes, who worked with Andre Agassi when I visited him in Las Vegas, was he did these things. It was like 5-5-5s, and let's just say it was like a hip flexor exercise. He would do, if you do 5 like really slow, like just slow controlled reps, and then 5 like faster, and then 5 like really faster on a rhythm or something like that. And I was just talking with Rob Assis, the idea of like almost like and I've seen this with vertical jump too. Like it's like a game. Now you could do this with weights too, but like it's like you're on a jump mat. First jump, do 20 inches, then try to do 21, then try to do 22. And like you're just going a little bit higher. And that game is an amazing warm up for actually jumping as high as possible too, where it's like, here's a game and we're playing with max effort. We're playing with velocity. And then it almost like primes you to be on all these levels, and then you get a higher output versus, just max everything on the way to warm up, like that kind of thing.
Right, for start. Yeah. No, it's kind of building up the goals for sure. Yeah. I think that in the intentions, that's another thing you can play with for sure.
Cool. Yeah, just it helps me to kind of to be able to get these categories. Here's the constraints. Here's the differential.
And you're right, it's a little gray area, but that's the way that I kind of think of them. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so back to I guess like when do the extremes, right? Like when is this? I guess not so much when is it too much variability, but more so like when did that not work? I'd like to ask you your take on the innate ability for athletes to figure it out themselves, in the sense of, let's just say, back to variability. Like I come up with this constraint, and maybe it's a single athlete. It's not even like a team thing. Single athlete made him a constraint, didn't work. Where does the athlete's problem solving, like how do I frame this? How do you know that it's the athlete's something to do with the athlete's problem solving ability, if that makes sense, versus maybe just wrong constraint? Do you ever go into, hey, we're going to keep the constraint, but maybe you need to frame it differently, or there's an analogy, or does that make sense? Like kind of getting into that.
For sure. That I think this is, as a coach, you kind of got to diagnose, what are they not doing? How are they not adjusting to this constraint? And adding even with the small sided games and team sports, like you maybe set up a thing because you want them to reverse the ball to the other side of the field more often, and they're not doing it. As a coach, I think you can step in and kind of point out, why don't you try that? You're not correcting and telling them this is what you have to do. As a coach, why don't you try dropping your shoulders a bit more? It sounds like a bit like what we were kind of trying to avoid, but just to give people a little, or an analogy. Analogy is even better, right? And it's like a tennis, we say, swing like a rainbow. Or if you're doing like a drop shot, imagine you're an elephant, right? You're trying to get the movement through an analogy, for sure. So yeah, you can. I think adding in, I like to think of instructions as just another constraint. Cues are just another constraint you're adding to help guide the person to explore different things. But then, I think if I can think of another constraint that kind of achieves the same thing I want, sometimes I'll move to that if the person's really not grasping it at all. Then you don't want to stay with it forever, for sure. Or drop it for this session and come back to it the next day. I think it's it does happen sometimes, for sure.
What do you think of? I've just had this discussion on a few recent podcasts. So in terms of constraints, or it's almost like constraints within constraints. Or it's like a dream within a dream. Like what was that? That movie, like
Inception.
Yeah, Inception. Yeah, exactly. Like we're just going like all these layers into it. And so it's almost like, yeah, if you have your constraint and then you have your cue within a constraint. What's your thoughts on like velocity? Like, let's just say it's baseball and increasing the pitch velocity, or just playing with Bobby White talked about speeding up drills, like actually making the drill faster than it should be. And there's your constraint or something like that. Do you have any thoughts on that, like manipulating velocity, like as in you're trying to make things happen? I guess a small-sided game does, right, with passing and decision making.
Yeah, for sure. Or time, like giving people less time is a good constraint to manipulate. Sometimes those work great, because what another way that I like to think about it is constraints. You're trying to incentivize the person's body, right? You're trying to create a situation where what they're doing now is not working, right? So they got to try something different. You're trying, not telling them a solution, you're trying to incentivize them to try something different. And sometimes when you speed the pitch up or give them less time, they just won't work. If you have a big hitch, you move your hands around a lot when you swing, you start with them really low, you're never going to get to the ball. So you keep missing and missing, and you have to try something different. And it encourages you self-organization. It can be great as long as it doesn't just lead to people giving up and not having any success. So you have to kind of achieve a balance like that. But and Franz Bosch talks about a lot about this. When you really ramp up the constraints, like high velocity, short times, high force, it really reduces the amount of things, the solutions you can do, right?
Yeah.
So if a person is really struggling to figure out how to do something, sometimes those things will, like, there's not that many options, right? Like in baseball, if you're trying to throw as hard as possible, there's only so many ways you can do it, right? You can't try just anything. Whereas if I just say, get the ball over the mound, you could throw it underhand, left hand, you know what I mean? So over the plate. I think that those can be very good. They can kind of push people, but as long as it's not too far beyond what they can handle.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about different skills with how many solutions are there. I mean, I'm trying to think right now just on a level of like things that everyone could kind of resonate, or most people on the show would resonate with. It's almost like a basketball hoop. Like if you're trying to dunk, when that hoop is 10 feet, maybe I can just jump off one leg and one hand. Like that's my only solution. Take it down 2 more inches. Okay, now I can do like 6 solutions to solve dunk it, and take it down to 6 feet, and I can probably do 100 different. Well, hopefully that'd be pretty cool if I could do 100 different solutions. But it's interesting to think about it that way, and it almost kind of like opens things up on some level. If I was maybe like the flow of practice, it's almost like moving from more solutions to less. I know when I was coaching high jump, sometimes I would open practice with just saying, all right. I might have been too rigid. I probably, because I gave the solutions, like we start with the low bar. It'd be like, if these guys could jump, 2 meters, we started at the bar at like 1 meter 40. And I would say, all right, do a tuck jump, do a scissor jump, do a this jump. And if it was me now, I think I would just say, all right, we're going to warm up and the bar's at this, and show me 10 different ways. You figure out 10 ways to jump over it, and then we'll go up a little bit, and then maybe make it a little bit different, and then maybe make it a little bit, and maybe I could put a timer on it too. Maybe it's like, all right, you have to get over this so many times, and that's a constraint as well. And then as you keep going up, the solutions become less and less and less.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I think, Joel, that you doing, show me 10, they all have to be different. Show me 10 different ways of getting over the bar. I think like a large part of all of this is having the why in mind, right?
Yeah.
So when you do that, you're not trying to get them to jump a certain, right? You're getting them to learn about their body, how their body moves relative to the bar, and try to, body awareness. You don't really care if what they learn is going to work at a real, you'll get to that later. And then you add the constraint of height. You're trying to push them. Then you want to filter out some of those, right? That's never going to work because you're not transferring enough force from the ground. You're never going to get that high. Mm-hmm. So that barrel roll or whatever you did when it was really low, okay, well, that one will drop out. So at that point, the why is to get them to have certain features of the movement that what you need to get over the highest, right? So yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it for sure.
Yeah, I wish I would have learned. Actually, sometimes I think back to what would I have changed about my experience in track as a younger athlete, like 8th grade, 9th grade, and almost because I actually think that I probably jumped pretty close to whatever my genetic potential is. I actually think once I was in college, I mean, I got up there to about, I think I always joke that I was the most unathletic person to jump 7 feet ever. And I mean, I'm not like, I guess in the grand scheme of things, I mean, relative to all other people who high jump 7 feet, I was probably not as fast, not as strong, not as, built as springily or whatever that word is. But I do think that if I could go back, I would have, because like my straddle high jump was garbage. Like some of the other ways to jump over the bar were not very good. And I would have started hurdles, track and field hurdles a lot earlier. I would have done, I watch Stefan Holm. It's funny, I've probably mentioned him twice in the last 3 podcasts, but a well-known Swedish high jumper. He's like 5 feet 11, jumps 7 feet 10, like one of the best like efficiency jumpers of all time, height over head. And there's a video. Actually, I should put it in the show notes. He's it's called like the 6 degrees of jumping. He's jumping over the bar like 6 different ways, and each one he can get a little higher. The first one he does like kind of a front flip over it with like 6 feet, and then he puts it up a little bit and he does a different kind of jump. And back when I first saw that back in the day, I just didn't pay too much attention. I was like, oh, I guess he's just really likes high jumping all these ways. I didn't, nothing connected. And then it's like, oh, like it's all part of that ability to learn from all these and just have variability, and then to be able to put this final technique together. Whereas I just don't think I ever really looked at it that way. So if I could go back, I think I would have changed that about my rotating for sure.
That's interesting. I can't remember what I saw a video, I think it was yesterday, it was this group of people, they were doing this task where they had to, kind of like the Ninja Warrior, where you have to scale. It was a mat on a wall. They had to jump, scale, and stick a Post-it note up as high as they could.
Oh, yeah, I see something like that, yeah.
The progression of people, the way that they saw, they went from kind of running up to jumping and launching, like as they saw the next person get way higher. It was interesting to eat. So I think within yourself, you learn kind of the same. But you never do that, right? If you're doing, okay, here's how you get as high as possible. It's almost better if the athlete finds it themselves, even if it was the way you would have told them to do it anyway from the start, because they learn how to change it, how to adjust it, why it works, the kind of things like that, for sure.
Yeah, I had I didn't actually train in Anatoly Bondarchuk's, the track coach's group, but and Kimberly Johnson was on this podcast, but a recent podcast or chat I had was Andrew Schaaf, and he wrote an article called Push the Hammer, and he's a swim coach with a strength and conditioning background, and basically it was like Bondarchuk, like he didn't speak English well, and from what he wrote, like a lot of times it was just, if people asked for feedback, it was just push the hammer. Like it was kind of ambiguous. And it's almost like, but then they would eventually learn themselves and get there. And it's like, that's it. You push the hammer. It's like this Zen riddle instead of being like, oh, you need to do this and this and this and this and this along the way. And that's actually something I've been thinking about, is having, it's almost like like every coach, I think, has these cues they come up with over time. And a lot of them are just standard. They're like small, very simple. I feel like I have control over this problem, like things we say, like, I mean, how hard is it to say knee up, heel up, toe up, and running? Like that's the easiest thing in the world. Like, and in my opinion, it actually doesn't solve a lot of problems, because when you actually have horizontal velocity, it's just different. But I'm thinking more about having these almost like slightly more ambiguous coaching terms that they're with the intention of the athlete having to figure it out, and being okay with that, not feeling like I have to give something to everybody that is like this discrete, oh, this is going to solve your issues, or because it's not me. I'm not solving your issue, your technical issues. It's you who is. And so I've just become a lot more aware of that. It's like this, I need to get out a notebook in the morning and start kind of writing these things down. Like, how can I make this a little bit more ambiguous sometimes and not always feel like I need to do that?
I think, there's lots of, you go to the focus of attention research and all, stuff Nick Winkelman talks about, just the swing like a rainbow, run like an elephant. Yeah. Get you thinking about the outcome, the rhythm, the pattern of your movement, not what your knee is doing, what your toe is doing, which we know we don't want you thinking about whether your toe is pointing up or down.
Yes.
We want to think about whether your path is an arc, right? That's a much better way to get people. And you're right, that's something really underrated, understudied, and we don't think about is how athletes interpret the cues. We assume as a coach, everyone's going to be exactly on the same page as me when I say swing like a rainbow, but they have their own interpretation of what that means to them and how they do it, how they achieve it. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I think that'd be really funny though. Like all these, tennis kids come into camp and the only feedback they hear is swing like a rainbow. And then maybe at the end, you did it. You did it. Yeah, I won't tell you anything else. the whole time.
It's one of the challenges I work with a lot of coaches using these methods, and one of the challenges to overcome is the parents. Like, they pay all this money,
Yes.
and you're like, you do an elephant, and they're like, what are you? And they're playing like silly games where the ones that my kids play, they play this game Jail, where you hit the ball and someone on the other side tries to catch it. Your parents are looking, what are you? As opposed to nice drills and lines, and you giving lots of instructions about how to position your arm and leg. That just sounds better. It sounds like it should work rather than letting kids do it on their own, you being quiet most of the time. So it is a bit of a challenge. I kind of have to educate people and set their expectations.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the saying, the best things in life are free. And I think sometimes it's like even like breathing, you go to like on like a breathwork class or something, like, hey, air is free. Like, it's it is kind of funny. But of course you pay to go to the breathwork class to be taught to do something your body can already do, obviously. But it's just interesting to consider. So one last question here before we round out our time, and this actually goes back maybe to variable learning a little bit, and I don't think we went into this on our last talk, so I would like to just touch on it, is long-term development in these things. And if I asked you this last time, I mean, maybe you could answer in a different way. I don't think I did. That's the idea of in your book, How We Learn to Move, you talked about baseball players like at a lower level, maybe it's 15 years old, and they tracked them year to year to year based off how much variability they were getting. And they found out that the ones who were like could make the college or the next level, there was something that had to happen with them, specifically with variability. Could you just share a little bit about that? And because I just think about, I love talking about youth sports, and I think people who work with college or high school are like, whatever, I don't know. But it's like, it's all connected, like, and it's really important. And so, yeah, could you share a little bit about that study and how you look at like just baseball training, for example, in light of that study and variability?
Yeah, so I think that was one of my studies actually, where we kind of gave people different levels of variability in training and kind of tracked how they developed, or whether they got drafted, made to the pros, and we've had a clearer benefit of kind of adding variability. So yeah, I say like with the developmental cycle, there's a couple things that I think are essential for one is scaling up the variability. I think it's important to recognize at the start you can't add like a ton of different variables and these kind of things we've been talking about, because most athletes are going to show up with their own variability. Like, they're really inconsistent. They don't know what to do. So if you drop in different bat weights and spin velocity and all this, they'll be overwhelmed. Yeah. So you want to start simple and then add it. And then the other thing that I've just seen really separates is, it's the basic fundamental idea of Erickson's deliberate practice. It's working on having the why of practice. What am I trying to work on this set of swings and batting practice? Like, the big difference I've seen with the really great athletes, the lesser skilled athletes just go up, okay, I'm just going to swing and hit 20 pitches. The good ones say, okay, I'm going to work on not swinging at pitches that are outside. I'm going to work on doing this. They have a specific intention. They're trying to improve something they're not good at. Right? They're being progressively adding practice to achieve something, not just going through the motions of let's do another 100 reps. Let's do, Yeah. So those are the two big things I see, as you develop and you build, kind of progressively adding the variability. I think it also kind of takes the shape of, exploration, finding a solution, like in high jumping, right? You want them to explore, find the solution. And then once you work with a better athlete that has the basic pattern, then you're adding variability to kind of get them to optimize it. What slightly better way could they do the run up to get more force and things like that? So yeah, I think it's going through this progression and always kind of working on, challenging yourself, having the why of practice. What am I trying to work on that I can improve?
Yeah, that makes sense. So like, within high jumping specifically too, like if I took, I guess if the constraint is the typical Fosbury flop style, because when differential, there's like all sorts of different ways that I guess are, you could run and do a flip over it. That's more differential. It's not how you'd actually do it. But if I had a young athlete and it's like, all right, I want you to do, like, I like using constraints on the approach. Like, all right, you're going to bound. Here's some 2 cones halfway in the approach, and I want you to bound between these cones to build momentum and then run and jump, or different things like that, or even like one thing I used to do when I hurt my hamstring was just hop on one leg all the way to the bar and hop over and flop over off one leg. And like, but if I asked a total beginner to do that stuff, they would get overwhelmed. Like, it's just too much.
Sure.
So in like baseball, for example, like I guess you like VR baseball, right? Like if it's a more of a novice player and it's all sorts of crazy pitches all over the place, would that like be too many? Like you would want to say maybe here's like 3 pitches and you have to learn, or maybe just 2, and then it's occasionally going to be outside, it's occasionally in, and you just have where the intention is to learn to swing at good pitches. Versus if it's like 6 different pitches, maybe that's too much information. Like would that be kind of accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly what we did in the kind of my study. We had like you started off with only a couple different pitch types. They all kind of went down the middle, and it wasn't a huge range in speed. And then as you got some success, those things started to change. You got more variability in speed, location, type, and so we kind of built on it. Yeah, you kind of have to, both for their confidence and just to to performance, you have to kind of let them build and at least start like and it's example we went going back to the volleyball. Getting proficiency playing with a super light, oversized ball, and then adding the regulation ball as you get later on, I think is definitely the way to go.
Cool. And then the study you did, like what led to who was the most successful, or what led to the most success, or was it your study against like a group that had less variability? Just quickly before we get out of here.
Yeah. So what I did, I basically had 4. So what I did was I took high school players. And I think there was 4 different groups. Well, one of them was just a control group that just did the regular baseball practice. There was another group I gave extra batting practice. So once a week they would come to a cage. We go through, and it was traditional batting practice where they're hitting off a machine that was throwing the same speed basically every time. And then I had a VR version of that. And then the group that did the best was the one that I just described. They had extra batting practice, but what it did was it added variability in pitch type, pitch speeds, pitch locations progressively as they got better and better. So what I think VR is good for is not recreating the real world so much, but you can add things. Like adding variability to practice is sometimes difficult, especially working with a lot of players. Also challenging people at the right level. So I would have to get a pitching machine and run and change all the settings.
Oh yeah, too much.
Yeah. So in VR, I can do that easily. I can just program it to learn to adjust to your performance. So that's what we tried to do. So the group that got more variable conditions ended up doing better in the test after the study. They did better in the next season of high school in their batting statistics. And then we just followed them, and they got drafted more often and and things like that. So yeah, it took a long time. It took me 10 years to do the whole study. But I think it is an interesting result.
Yeah, super. Yeah, I love reading about that in your book. It's really cool stuff. And I think it kind of it's a good like capstone in a way to this little 2-part series we did on the differential and the variable learning, and kind of putting that all together. Like, look, when you do it right and you have an intention, you stretch just this much, then that can be the result at the end. So very cool.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to another show. It was great to have you here. If you enjoy what we're doing, you can help us out by leaving us a rating or review on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you're listening to. I would totally appreciate that. We'll see you all back next week.